Hey pals, we welcome all to the live stream of the FEYGIN World YouTube channel, and we thank all those who are joining us. It's an honor and pleasure for you to work with us, considering that this is still a new format for us, so the new audience joining us is valuable to us. Friends, remember that here on YouTube we have our own rules of existence, and the one who wins is the one who supports and spreads the information the most actively. Don't forget to like, definitely subscribe to FEYGIN World YouTube channel, stick with us, and of course leave comments because the topics, in one way or another, directly affect the future of the whole world. Well, of course, all the topics, everything today we will be discussing in the company of Mark FEYGIN.
Glad to welcome Alina, glad to welcome all the viewers of the channel. Well,
Hey Mark, how's it going? Mark, well, while they were counting the drawn, invented, actually thrown votes for the war criminal Putin in Moscow. By the way, I really like how in Ukraine many journalists have made the decision not to refer to Putin as president anymore. I will also proceed and just call him Putin. While they were throwing these voices for him, alternative analysts calculated that approximately a minimum of 20 million of them were thrown in total, according to their calculations and estimations. More optimistic forecasts or grandiose ones say 30. Basically, he's just continuing to grab power for himself. But what's important to us? Either way, the Kremlin is keeping an eye on the West, seeing whether they'll acknowledge it or not, congratulate or not. None of the European leaders, nor any Western officials, of course, recognized these elections as legitimate, as they were widely disputed. However, for us, perhaps one of the most crucial inquiries is, what exactly is the White House? The White House stated following these elections that the truth is Putin remains the president. I'm quoting the words of Jack Sullivan, the National Security Advisor to the US president. Yeah, he states that there was a considerable amount of unfreedom, there was a significant level of injustice, a rather large amount of injustice during these elections, but nonetheless, that is the reality. What does this mean? Do they leave a negotiation window, or is the world structured so that if he's in power, he's still regarded as the president?
both this and that, both this and that. Because you see, there were options for a reaction that implied a harsh denial of the elections, essentially delegitimizing Putin as the first official person of the president of the Russian Federation. You do not recognize him as the president. You state that there were no elections. Power has been usurped. Well, it is illegally usurping, even according to the laws of the Russian Federation, the Constitution, and other regulatory acts. But are you prepared to continue negotiating with him if it is regarding the significant matters, the crucial questions of war and peace? There's nothing you can do. He's taken over power. He's got this massive, almost 150 million strong country under his control. He initiated a conflict with Ukraine's western neighbor. You're not taking any action. Yeah, I understand. I'll need to talk to him when the time comes. When will there be such an opportunity? Nevertheless, you do not have to recognize him as the president, the elected person, the top official of a country that is, in general, an aggressor and known for its aggressive actions. That carries out an aggressive policy not only towards Ukraine and other neighbors, but also towards the entire civilized world. And here, I think, is a big problem with understanding what's going on in Russia. You got to specifically mention that. The thing is, when Jack Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, formulates his attitude towards what happened on March 17th in Russia, he still starts from the understanding that there are elections, for example, like the ones that happened in America. And then the question becomes natural. Yeah, there were elections. Yeah, Putin declared himself president, but it was all a bunch of baloney, meaning the procedure wasn't followed and there weren't any real elections in terms of having independent candidates competing, having debates, freely expressing their opinions, and so on and so forth. There's absolutely nothing like this in Russia. So there are no elections at all as a process, no elections as a procedure, no elections as an institution, a source of power formation in Russia. This is crucial to grasp. In this comprehension, it doesn't matter if there were politicizations or not. 20M votes thrown away or 100M. It doesn't matter. The thing is, the current government in Russia just pulls the number of support for Putin out of thin air completely arbitrarily at around 87% of the votes. She's real. It's not a question of being unreal, you know. This is comparable to the Stalinist elections. In the 30s and 40s, there were elections. We had elections too. After the war, step-by-step elections were held in the Soviet Union, a totalitarian country with elections. Soviet authorities were elected and people participated. Yeah, one candidate, no multiple candidates, but they didn't differ much from current elections under Putin, you know. However, it is not possible to refer to them as elections. When an individual such as Jack Sullivan, a conscientious government official in the United States, speaks about elections and the creation of government entities through these elections in Russia, it presents an opportunity to manipulate this concept. That's when they say these are bad choices. This is the US point of view. And Russia says, no, these are good elections. No elections happening. Military totalitarian dictatorship, militaristic dictatorship, criminal dictatorship seizes power, holds population under complete total control. So you see, it's clear there's no president in Russia, like at all. Calling Putin a president is impossible. However, that does not imply that you can't negotiate with him directly or through intermediaries. That is possible, but it doesn't mean you should consider yourself equal to him. President Biden is not equal to President Putin. President Trump, if he wins the elections, won't be equal to President Putin. They're just negotiating with the other side, their representative. Yeah, Russia today is all about Putin, but that doesn't mean that other countries, civilized countries, have to recognize him as the president of the Russian Federation. Someone will say, it doesn't matter what it's called, but call it any other term. And actually, this is very important because the United States, like other civilized countries, for example, France and so on, they adhere to the primacy of international law norms. So basically, they acknowledge international law as a tool for maintaining relationships with other countries. They are based on international laws. In Russia, this primate doesn't come out of it. They come from red lines, their own understanding of the law, and whatever else you can think of. But that has nothing to do with international law. And if countries are civilized and guided by international law, then they can't recognize any president of Russia like Putin. He ain't like them. This is the boss of a gang, the leader of a gang that has taken over a huge country, seized its resources, has nuclear weapons, exploits the population by sending them to die and kill in the territory of a neighboring country. But he is not a president by any means. He's not on the same level as President Macron, President Biden, or any other representative of civilized and free societies. Someone will say this is a rhetorical game. You're just trying to argue about words. But that's not true. Because if you recognize it as an equal and full-fledged side of negotiations, then you are applying to it the norms of law and requirements that you would apply to any civilized person. And you have to talk to him like a criminal, a war criminal, like a person who has usurped power, and then completely different rules apply. You are not obliged, Americans, French, Europeans, to comply with the norms of international law in relation to Putin. You understand? They stop having any effect. You can use military force, cunning, deception, you understand, because all of this is permissible in relation to a criminal. This is the key difference in understanding what happened in Russia. Yes, for the American consciousness, for the American layman, even for the American establishment, it is impossible to fully understand what is happening in Russia. It just doesn't work like that, you understand? People who reside in a system of free elections simply cannot comprehend how it can all function. How do individuals who place their ballot into the slot of the ballot box for voting not have an impact on the result, which is publicly announced information about which candidate received how many votes in the election? Putin's real rating is definitely lower. That doesn't mean that most people don't support him out of fear, ideological support, tradition, or whatever else. But I want to emphasize once again that the norms of international law that are accepted in civilized society towards leaders of countries who respect this law should not apply to Putin. Do you comprehend? When it concerns him, military laws should be applied, and even negotiations that can be carried out with him ought to be conducted precisely based on this significant thesis that he has no rights from the standpoint of international law. He cannot demand anything, you understand? And humanitarian or international legal norms should not be applicable to him. Anything is permissible when it concerns him. There are no limitations. Until this crucial consideration is put into action, in the event that they do not follow it, Putin will always come out on top, you know? He has a knack for maintaining his position of power. He's freeloading off the rules that the civilized world follows. He's leeching off of them. He's taking advantage of them. And the world responds to him according to the rules of civilized world, and you can't do that under any circumstances.
I truly appreciate your formula in which you essentially state that he is not any more polished than them. Yeah, he seized power. Yeah, he controls it. But when we look at the list of those who congratulated him on his re-election, that's just his crowd. Because yesterday it was the Fussites, today it's Hamas. I don't remember, probably until the representatives of the Taliban haven't made it. It's North Korea, Iran, the self-proclaimed president of Belarus, Lukashenko. Of course, there's also Jinping, the leader of China. There's the president of Turkey. But they are more of an exception than a confirmation of that rule where he is located. So it's impossible to perceive him as an equal. Simultaneously, Putin is attempting to utilize his preferred weapon. He carried it out instantaneously on the 18th, immediately following the announcement of the election results, in order to reiterate to everyone that undoubtedly Russia is a nuclear power, and without a doubt that they purportedly have no fears or apprehensions whatsoever. Putin did not rule out the possibility of a full-scale conflict with NATO. Putin stated that he perceives the risks of events escalating to the magnitude of the previous World War III. And why am I recalling this? Besides the fact that obviously it is some sort of bluff and blackmail rhetoric, the Third World War, it does not exclude anyone. Particularly when we are discussing nuclear blackmail, that is something that is most likely targeted more towards both Europe and America. Today is extremely fascinating, and Donald Trump mentioned, he's like, no, wait. If I do become president, I am not going to pull the United States of America out of NATO. However, when it comes to these threats, how should they be perceived in a location somewhere out west, across the ocean? There is a president who should be extremely happy, and yet the first thing he says is, I will take even more lives, I will send even more individuals to be killed, so prepare yourself. Can you handle the same cost?
Circumstances. I want to emphasize that what Putin says is what he really thinks. Now, that's a really important thesis. Very often we hear in the rhetoric in the West that, well, what is declared by Putin or his entourage in the elections, what is declared during political activities or the war in Ukraine, well, it's not quite true. So, for example, he has this guy, so to speak, under his control, this certain Medvedev, who at one time from 2008 to 2012 performed the functions of the president of the Russian Federation. Naturally, he wasn't any kind of president. He was just a puppet, not a real figure. Real power has never left Putin's hands, but he's talking about the possibility of a nuclear attack on European cities, London, Berlin, and Kiev, nuclear attacks. So these people are really ready to carry out this nuclear attack. The problem with the West is that it shouldn't back down. The Western countries should not indulge in this mood, tempting themselves to make a deal with Putin, appease him, and give in to his demands. To prevent nuclear war, show strength, not weakness. Demonstrate readiness like President Macron is doing now to avoid a potential nuclear conflict. So this individual, he is like, apologies, but we are also a nuclear power. We have nuclear weapons and missiles as well. Best of luck attempting to prevent us if we decide to deploy some French troops to Ukraine. Do you understand what I am saying? We are discussing approximately 2,000 military personnel, most likely from the French Foreign Legion, being dispatched to Ukraine. The Russians are stating that it is not a coincidence. They must have some insider information, maybe even obtained through unofficial channels. They have been cautioned that the French soldiers will be on Ukrainian territory, potentially carrying out military operations. We still do not know what kind of negotiations are taking place between Kiev and Paris regarding the objective of these French soldiers, but it is all about bringing an end to the conflict in Ukraine. I believe above all else, this is because of such a powerful reaction from Europe, from France. You can extrapolate the same thing to the question of nuclear threats. If Putin keeps threatening with nuclear weapons rhetorically, then every now and then, stating that he might or might not use them, the West should do the same. The Western countries must demonstrate their preparedness to engage in the Third World War, or is it already considered the Fourth World War in that region? If it becomes evident and explicitly demonstrated that we are willing to participate in a nuclear conflict, there will be no actual nuclear war. Putin will not initiate a nuclear war himself in order to evade the consequences of such a conflict, not just in terms of political power in Russia, but also in a physical sense. Because there ain't going to be no other outcome here. He's not ready for this. He doesn't want this. He wants to achieve all his political goals through blackmail, which he declared in Putin's memorandum in December 21st. He demanded to finalize a contract with Washington and an agreement with NATO to demilitarize half of the countries in NATO. There are almost 15 countries. So basically, they need to demilitarize them up to the border of May 1997. So these countries, mostly countries of the former Eastern Bloc, should basically stop existing as NATO countries de facto. Conditions for ensuring NATO security should not apply to them, because if all weapons, armaments, troops, and so on are removed from there, it would essentially give the aggressor the opportunity in the form of Russia to occupy these countries and rely solely on the fact that Putin won't feel like occupying these countries out of the goodness of his heart. But we see these aggressive actions towards the Baltic countries, Finland, Poland, and a number of other countries. Well, including Moldova, he's already waging war in Ukraine. Why should he give up his aggressive intentions towards other neighboring countries? Why? What's going to stop him if the West keeps showing weakness? And only if the West shows willingness to participate in the war and does it demonstratively, publicly, to prove this readiness, that is, simply starts moving troops, conducting exercises, deploying nuclear weapons, then there will be no war under any circumstances. Putin will not be the sole person accountable for resolving this problem. He may jeopardize the lives of others, but he definitely will not endanger his own. His same environment is ready to risk the lives of ordinary Russian citizens, but not their own lives. Now, this is important to emphasize. So the response to Putin's nuclear rhetoric must be clear, concise, and an equally strong response that implies the possibility of nuclear war, the start of nuclear war. And then we have the ability to steer clear of a
Let me ask you one more thing, Mark. I get it. You're talking about who's actually going to outsmart whom. Aggressor needs to know they'll face their own medicine, not necessary to be first to attack. Putin's strategy. But at the same time, if Europe, I think, largely agrees with your philosophy, they are preparing, they are making very strong statements and continue to help Ukraine. Then in America, while senators are deciding among themselves whether to lend or simply give money to Ukraine, Donald Trump comes out and when asked about assistance, if and when if elected by the American voters, becomes president, will he help Ukraine? Donald Trump implies that he really hopes that by that time, let's put it this way, roughly speaking, the war will be over in 9 months and there will be no need to transfer anything. So it turns out that not all individuals in the USA adhere to the philosophy of standing up to the aggressor. Yeah, perhaps it will simply conclude, this war will not be fought on behalf of us. What is your opinion on
nuclear war? In my opinion, it is nothing more than a mere campaign slogan, just a simple campaign gesture. Trump is presently unwilling to reveal his plan for resolving the war in Ukraine. He prefers to keep it confidential at the moment. I believe so. He is making an effort to avoid explicitly stating his intentions. I believe he thinks that by conversing with Putin, he will position himself as the last person standing between Putin and Zelensky, and he wants to maintain that influential position in the situation at hand. He'll say we need to divide land, occupied areas to Russia, while one's controlled by Kyiv, almost 80% of territory given to Ukraine. Ukraine has the right to do whatever it wants. So integrating with NATO, integrating with the European Union, going west for good. Putin does not want this. Putin, as I have said many times before, and this is an important understanding of the process, is that Putin wants all 100% of Ukraine. But now we realize that not just Ukraine. He desires not only Ukraine, but also the Suwalki corridor to Kaliningrad via Lithuania. He desires Chisinau in Moldova. He desires Georgia. He aims to acquire other areas from the Baltic countries and so forth. So the thing is, Trump himself doesn't really have a solid plan on how to resolve this conflict. He relies solely on his go-getter abilities as a businessman developer. He doesn't understand who he's dealing with until the end. And I'm starting to lean more towards him being an eccentric political figure, when, if he wins the elections, he will face the impossibility of solving this problem, as he sees himself as a businessman, as a negotiator, as a person who behaves very confidently towards other leaders of countries. It will not help him. Things have gone very far. He relies on his 4-year experience from 16 to 20 years old, when he was hanging out with Kim Jong-il, hanging out with other political leaders, and could, as it seemed to him, achieve the resolution of certain problems through threats, blackmail, pressure, and so on. However, currently we are in the midst of a war. He will have to negotiate with an individual who is using all these tools himself to achieve his political goals. That's just how Putin is. And if back then this question was a potential danger coming from Moscow towards Kiev, now it's a real danger. This is already a real war. These are real military events that are connected to Putin's actions. You understand? And in wartime, negotiating based on abstract concepts or accepted ethics, such as business ethics, is completely impossible. Different factors and considerations come into play in this context. This is the current situation.
This approach? An instance of this is the way Russians deploy their troops in territories that they have occupied. Occupied territories are being used against aggression, including in the Black Sea waters, which not only Ukraine suffers from, but also European countries. Well, of course, occupied territories are also a source of people for forced mobilization. Individuals who regrettably could have been utilized in the conflict against Europe. It is also worth remembering and not agreeing to any kind of occupation. Mark, thank you so much for taking the time for this chat. Friends, I want to remind you that it's crucial for us, whether you agree or not, to comment on what you think about the topics we're discussing today, especially what do you think about the elections in Russia? Don't forget to subscribe to the FEYGIN World YouTube channel. Give us a like. It's really important to us, and we'll see you real soon. Take care, everyone. Goodbye until the next broadcast.